Ann McManus seemed to have been born for the badge. In her hometown, everyone knew her as the quiet girl who grew up with a strict upbringing, where discipline was expected and mistakes were rarely forgiven. From an early age, she admired authority and control, often watching her father, a security guard, carry himself with a sense of pride that fascinated her. By the time she was old enough to decide on a career, Anne had already made up her mind. She wanted the uniform, the respect, and the certainty that came with enforcing the rules. When she joined the police academy at 21, her instructors noticed how determined she was. She was not the fastest or the strongest, but she was relentless. She studied late into the night, memorizing procedures, understanding every regulation, and practicing until her skills seemed flawless. When she returned to her small town as a sworn officer, her community embraced her as one of their own. Neighbors often told stories of how proud they were to see Anne driving through the streets in her patrol car, the same streets she had walked to school as a child. Older residents trusted her instantly, believing she represented safety and fairness. Families would point her out to their children, saying she was proof that hard work could lead to something admirable. Her colleagues described her as someone who never cut corners and never backed down from danger. She was the first to arrive at accidents, the first to volunteer for late-night patrols, and the one who took extra shifts without complaint. On the surface, her life seemed perfect, yet Anne kept herself distant, never fully letting anyone close. She rented a small apartment near the station, lived alone, and never spoke much about her personal struggles. She carried the image of the ideal officer so convincingly that no one noticed the loneliness behind her eyes or the way she sometimes lingered after work, staring at her reflection in the locker room mirror as if searching for someone she had lost. Her devotion to the job came at a cost. Her friendships were shallow, her family ties strained, and her finances quietly unstable. She worked hard, but her paycheck never seemed to stretch far enough. Debt piled up, though she hid it well, never letting her professional mask slip. What made Anne so respected was also what made her dangerous. She understood procedure better than anyone, and she knew how to present herself as the model of integrity. If she ever made mistakes, no one saw them. If she ever felt resentment, no one heard it. For years, she built a reputation that seemed unshakable, but it rested on a fragile foundation. Underneath the admiration and praise, she carried a weight of disappointment that grew heavier with every passing year. To the public, she was a flawless officer, the kind of figure they could trust with their lives. To herself, she was already fighting battles no one else could see, battles that would one day push her toward a path no one could have imagined. By her mid-30s, the image of Ann McManus as the perfect officer began to fade, though at first only in subtle ways. She was still respected by her peers, still trusted by the townspeople, yet something about her demeanor shifted. Those who worked closest to her noticed moments of impatience that had never been there before. Small bursts of anger surfaced when cases didn't go her way, and her once sharp attention to detail started showing cracks. For years, she had been the rising star of the department, expected to climb the ranks and take on leadership roles. But when promotions were handed out, they went to others. Younger officers with fewer years of service were chosen ahead of her, and though Anne tried to hide her frustration, it lingered in the background of everything she did. Around this time, incidents began occurring on her watch that raised quiet questions. A series of local burglaries ended in dead ends, and reports were filed in ways that left investigators puzzled. Items stolen from homes and small businesses seemed to vanish without trace, but months later, some of those same possessions appeared in pawn shops across the state. The trail was too faint to follow back to her, and Anne's reputation shielded her from any suspicion. In fact, she often volunteered to lead the investigations herself, presenting carefully crafted theories that explained the lack of progress. To her colleagues, she was still the hard-working officer who never hesitated to take on difficult cases. But beneath the polished reports and late-night hours was a pattern that hinted at something far more troubling. Her personal life grew increasingly secretive. She withdrew even further from friends, and while others spent weekends with family, Anne kept to herself. Rumors began spreading about her finances. Coworkers whispered that she was drowning in debt, though she never confirmed or denied it. There were quiet observations, too. Her clothes became noticeably newer, her car was replaced with a sleek model she shouldn't have been able to afford, and yet her paycheck had not increased. Those details might have gone unnoticed if not for her growing restlessness at work. She was no longer satisfied with following the rules she once defended so fiercely. Instead, she seemed to test the boundaries of what she could get away with, bending the law in small, almost unnoticeable ways. The shift in her personality was difficult to ignore. Cases she once pursued with determination were now handled with a sense of detachment. She grew cold, even toward victims who came to her seeking help. At the same time, she became sharper in her ability to manipulate others, using her knowledge of police procedure to control situations and silence questions. For years, she had been defined by her sense of duty, but that identity was slipping. What drove her forward now was not justice or service, but something darker, an ambition laced with resentment and the thrill of control. Anne had learned that her badge was more than a symbol of authority. It was a shield she could hide behind, one that allowed her to drift further into dangerous territory without being exposed. It was the beginning of a transformation that would take her from a trusted officer to something much more sinister. The night Paul Keating died marked the turning point in Anne McManus's descent. Paul was a well-known businessman in town, admired for his sharp mind and respected for his integrity. He ran a modest but successful construction company and had built his reputation on honesty. Yet, in the weeks before his death, Paul had been digging into something he should never have uncovered. His company had been contracted to do repair work at a warehouse on the outskirts of town, a site that, unknown to most, was tied to an underground smuggling operation. While reviewing paperwork and deliveries, Paul noticed irregularities that connected back to police records signed off by Anne herself. What seemed like clerical errors at first soon pointed toward a deeper pattern. Paul began documenting everything he found, determined to take the evidence to the proper authorities. But in doing so, he became the greatest threat to Anne's carefully hidden double life. On a cold evening, neighbors recalled hearing the distant hum of a car engine near Paul's garage long after dark. Hours later, Paul was discovered slumped against his workbench with a handgun loosely positioned near his hand and a note left on the counter. To anyone who glanced quickly, it looked like a tragic suicide. Yet the scene carried a quiet unease. Paul was not known to be a man in despair, nor did he leave behind the kind of unfinished business one would expect. Friends and family were shocked, describing him as someone full of plans and energy. Still, when police arrived, the stage details almost worked. The suicide note was short and mechanical, lacking the emotional weight of a final farewell, and the handwriting bore small but noticeable inconsistency. Even more unsettling was the absence of gunshot residue on Paul's hands, a detail that would later draw sharp suspicion. Despite the red flags, Anne took control of the scene quickly. As one of the first officers to arrive, she efficiently directed her colleagues, cataloged evidence, and wrote the initial report. To those present, she appeared calm and professional, masking the fact that she was orchestrating the cover-up. She presented the note as undeniable proof of suicide and carefully guided the investigation toward closing the case swiftly. Few questioned her authority, because for over a decade she had built her image as someone beyond doubt. Yet her presence that night was no coincidence. Paul had been preparing to share his findings, and Anne knew time was running out. Eliminating him was not a crime of impulse. It was a calculated act to protect herself from exposure. Whispers began almost immediately after the case was closed. People remembered seeing Anne's patrol car parked on Paul Street earlier that evening. Others noted how unusually fast the investigation wrapped up, with little room for further inquiry. Still, without direct proof, the suspicion remained only in hushed tones. Officially, Paul Keating's death was ruled a suicide, but those who knew him best carried quiet doubts. For Anne, the staged scene seemed like a victory. She had erased a threat and buried the truth beneath layers of false paperwork and her own trusted reputation. What she did not realize was that Paul had taken steps she had overlooked. He had hidden more than documents. He had left behind traces of the truth that would eventually unravel everything Anne had worked to protect. As the weeks passed after Paul Keating's death, the unease surrounding the case never completely faded. Officially, the file was closed, stamped with the word suicide, but quiet doubts persisted among those who had known him well. His family pressed for further investigation, while colleagues in his business pointed out how unlikely it was that Paul would abandon ongoing projects or leave without making arrangements for his workers. What seemed at first like a clean ending slowly began to unravel when investigators outside of Anne's immediate circle started noticing troubling patterns in her past cases. Detectives from a neighboring county had been reviewing unresolved incidents for an unrelated audit when her name surfaced repeatedly. It was subtle at first. Her reports filed in burglary cases where evidence disappeared, missing persons investigations where timelines seemed inconsistent, and even a traffic stop that ended fatally under circumstances that did not fully align with procedure. To most officers, these details looked like clerical oversights, but to the reviewing detectives, a pattern was becoming clear. Anne's cases often contained gaps, and those gaps almost always allowed potential suspects or missing evidence to slip through unnoticed. Meanwhile, Anne continued to present herself as a model officer. She volunteered for extra shifts, offered to help colleagues with their caseloads, and kept her demeanor calm and controlled. She was the first to suggest theories that diverted attention away from any lingering suspicion about Paul's death, and she worked late into the night crafting reports that painted her as thorough and professional. On the surface, she appeared unshaken, but beneath the facade, she was tightening her control over every detail, making sure no one could trace loose ends back to her. Despite her efforts, cracks continued to widen. To the people watching from behind closed curtains, it was unthinkable. The trusted officer at the center of their safety was now the one evading capture. Her flight ended only miles from where her childhood home once stood. Cornered near a stretch of road that bordered the woods, Anne abandoned her car and tried to disappear into the trees. But helicopters circled overhead and searchlights cut through the branches. The pursuit lasted only minutes before she was surrounded and taken into custody. In those final moments, stripped of her badge and authority, she no longer looked like the officer people had admired, but rather a figure broken by her own choices. Trial, the evidence unfolded with devastating clarity. The recordings, the falsified reports, the financial records that showed unexplained wealth, and the testimony of those who had doubted the suicide ruling all painted a chilling portrait. The jury needed little time to reach its decision. Anne McManus was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The same courtroom where she had once testified as a trusted officer now marked her downfall. Her story became a warning told far beyond her small town. Anne had started as a symbol of dedication and justice, only to twist the power she was given into a weapon for her own survival. In the end, the transformation was complete. From respected officer to convicted murderer, the name that once inspired trust would forever be remembered as the emblem of betrayal. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more true crime documentaries, don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to Crime Uncovered. Your support helps us bring more chilling cases to life.